Veterans for Victory Management Presentation by Joe Coddington, Entrepreneurship 301 at Western Carolina University, the year of our Lord 2016. Veterans for Victory. Veterans for Victory is a 501c3, which means it's a nonprofit company that's going to change the way we treat the wounds and injuries of service. Many wounds are easy to see. Clearly, someone who has lost a limb to the cost of war or to the cost of being a first responder is clearly obvious. But a lot of other wounds aren't so obvious. And that's where Veterans for Victory comes into play. We're here to find a way to give back to the 1% that actually serve. Something very different for a nonprofit. From past experience of a nonprofit, I feel it's important to establish ownership of the nonprofit. Now, legally, this is not something that is normally done. However, it is possible to establish ownership of the original assets of the company. So, to establish the original assets of the company, I myself, the CEO and founder of Veterans for Victory, will maintain 70% equity of the original assets. This gives me a traditional controlling advantage and an additional responsibility to my shareholders, my stakeholders, which are basically the veterans. Any board member will come in and they will split a 20% extra equity of the original assets of the company. So as board members change over, they must buy in or buy out the previous board member in that process. Now, this is very unorthodox. However, I feel it will establish a board member that is serious enough to put up some of his wallet and his time to establish a position on this board. It's not just a namesake, it's not just something for a resume, it is something with an obligation to the veterans. However, also moving forward, the participants of this program will get 10% equity of any and all assets. So if this company grows to be 100 million, the participants themselves will have a 10% equity in what that process. So for example, if we are a $100 million a year company, the participants have 10% of that, which is 10 million a year, that must be directed into the participants specifically. Now I know that some people that are thinking this with a 501c3 means, well, if you're going to do a normal 501c3, you want to shoot for an 85 to 90% of every dollar going directly toward participants. This is slightly different because this is something they actually own. So if this company were to ever dissolve, this money would be distributed among participants in the program equally or some other system to establish some equity toward the participants. It also will allow the participants to feel like they have an ownership in this company that exists to help them. Very different from a traditional path, but I think it's something that would be exciting. So, source of income, it's a 501c3, so it's all about fundraising in the end, isn't it? So, the basic plan here is to come up 45% of the donator basis will be based on about a $20 a month campaign. For example, if you can get 20 donors to do $1,000 a month, you're making $20,000 a month. Well, we're going to try and operate on a principle of 2,000 donors doing $20 a month. It's worked very successful for many other companies. I believe it could be successful for us. Of course, we want to tie into corporate sponsorship packages, and we're looking for about 20% of our annual budget. And then, of course, you're looking for large donors, which are going to be 100,000 plus, counting on approximately 10%. And then any other kind of fundraising that we could do, somewhere between 20 and 25. Now, these numbers are going to fluctuate from year to year, but this is a target projected on about $18 million a year in funding of where this company might sit. Our structural chart. Pretty simple, pretty standard for a structural chart, but let's look at it really closely. You have the founder and CEO, who is myself, Joe Coddington, and of course I will have an assistant to track and maintain things. And initially that assistant will be flexible toward other personnel that are involved, but eventually each leadership wing will have an admin assistant. We're going to share assistants where we can in order to be more uh, responsible with our donating dollars. If we look to the left as you look at the screen of this chart, we have a community programs director. These are programs that are focused on local community sites where daily interaction with our veterans and first responders take place. Beneath them, you have a West, Central, and East officer, and then believe that you have a variety of local chapter representatives. So it may be necessary to add in another level of command, for each person can only effectively manage about 9. However, right now we have a 3-pronged system handling each of the chapters in a region. So each local city might have a local chapter volunteer who will be reporting to the Community West officer, who reports to the Community Programs Director, who reports to the founder. If we go just over our programs, our rehabilitation programs, these are actual events that we schedule as a company to interact with the vets occasionally or 5 times a year or 10 times a year, but they're actual event programs that are established. This director will be having reporting to him a similar setup of regional rehab officers, a west, a central, and an east, and then he will have local chapter volunteers. Now, these local chapter volunteers will focus on events, be it fundraising events, program events, or rehabilitation events. These local chapters are event focused, whereas on our community programs, they're much more site and structurally focused. So, for an example, the difference between a local chapter volunteer on rehab and a local chapter on community: a community volunteer has a site where people come to report. He will be working with a local chapter volunteer who focuses on a weekly bike ride or mountain climbing or whatever activity it is that that region would do. So, there's the difference between those two positions. If we move to the right of our chart as you look at the screen, we have an advocacy and development VP. This person is responsible for our legal efforts. We're meeting with Congress, meeting with the VA, or any other group to advocate toward benefits. And their also primary responsibility is development and fundraising. Underneath them, they will have a sponsor, corporate officer, and a development donors officer. These positions are different because they're different ethical values of how they can be compensated. A sponsor and corporate person may receive bonuses, whereas a development on donors, traditionally it's considered unethical to have that person receive additional compensation for seeking out donors. Therefore, we must have a separation. It may be necessary in the future to establish a networking structure underneath them, but at this time, it will stop at these 2 positions. And then on the far right, along the last positions, we'll be hiring, but hopefully at the end of the year 1, we will have a financial and legal vice president. This person will help with the advocacy person and our financials and our legal issues that present themselves. They therefore must understand and be able to deal with the chief financial positions. And then lastly on this chart, we have the advocacy person. This person focuses on networking with any founders, vendors, or organizations that might be able to provide legal aid to our participants and our veterans or first responders. So we kind of covered this, but this is a write-up of the positions that we talked about. The CEO is primarily responsible for the daily flow of the company. Community programs is the execution and staffing. Monitoring of programs is guided by the CEO. The officers are the actual sites themselves. And we're looking at a rehabilitations program director. They want to look toward the event side. Development focuses on the sales and funding. And then as you can see, as you move down this staff narrative, each position is targeted a little bit differently as we go through. Now, if you look at the recruiting, each one of these sites, what we want to try and find is someone who has different needs or expectations. But the basic skill sets that abound are going to be a veteran first, a cyclist, and cycling is going to be one of our primary components, and a sound business person. These people need to understand creation, execution, profitability, and all in all, every person here needs to be able to put the team and the mission above themselves. They need to understand how to follow, need to understand how to be a jack of all trades, and mostly importantly, have a servant's heart. And as you can see, this stays true through all of our sites, program officers, community officers, and even our financial and legal VP. So this is the basics of how we're going to be recruiting our staff. And then here's the page that everybody's most concerned about, our year 1 compensation. As you can see, the first month We have the CEO alone establishing everything that needs to happen. And then we have a staggered start schedule of each officer in each position as we go forward. Once this is established, we're looking at a uh, potential payroll of about $1 million a year, or just under about 85,000 a month. And then our first one compensation, actual compensation, only about $535,000. So depending how we choose to hire or establish people, or perhaps we use a volunteer in a couple paid staff positions, we can mitigate some of that financial burden. But the ultimate task is to make sure that we have enough funds of about $500,000 a year by 3 years just to cover compensation. So what we need to try to secure is about $1 million a year for 3 years committed on day one. It's a big task, but I'm sure that we can figure out a way to make it work, move forward, and establish a business over this phase of 1 year that can service our vets, our first responders, and truly provide a unique service to those struggling with PTSD, suicide thoughts, and other mental wounds of war that aren't necessarily as obvious as the physical ones. Thank you for your time.